Hello and welcome to the Bigger, Braver Life Show. I'm your host, Angela Marie Williams. As an entrepreneur and success coach, my mission is to empower you to realize your dreams and potential through transformational experiences. The purpose of this show is to inspire your positive change by learning from a community of those paving the way to a bigger, braver life. Hey everyone, welcome to the Bigger, Braver Life Show. I'm your coach, Angela Marie Williams. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and success coach supporting you through all of your braver decision making to reach your big goals. I'm so excited to welcome my next guest. Her name is Michelle Irving, and she is a chronic illness mentor. And I can't wait to dig in. She's got a lot of wonderful stuff to share with us today. So welcome, Michelle. How are you?
I'm fabulous, Angela, and thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me.
Michelle, please tell us a little bit about you, where you're at in the world, your work that you do. Tell us more about you.
So I'm a chronic illness mentor. The background for me is that I've lived with chronic illness for over about 18 years now. And what I do is I help women, intelligent, talented women who are living with chronic illness, which is no easy thing to navigate. I help them find a way through. And that can be finding their way through with love. That can be finding their way through with their own sense of boundaries and personal power, and also into meaningful work that works for us, for them, for us, and our bodies. So that's what I do.
Wonderful. And you're coming to us live from Australia today, right?
I'm in Australia, but over 80% of my clients are actually in the US. So I'm very familiar with the experience of chronic illness in the US. And when we think about chronic illness, we're talking about 133 million Americans, half of which are women, and most likely 70% of those are working. And we're talking similar statistics in Europe and Australia. So what we're talking about is your family, your friends, your coworkers, and a lot of chronic illness is actually invisible. So you may not know that they're experiencing it. So if you think sort of over 30 to 40% of your colleagues at work are navigating chronic illness.
Wow. Right. And I think that's something that flies under the radar when it's that invisible piece. We can't see it. And so it's easily away from the mind. I'd love to hear more about how you found your own path and how you do this work with other people.
So nobody wakes up in the world and says, I'm going to be a chronic illness mentor. That's what I'm going to do. And it's never something I thought I would do, but none of us think we're going to get chronic illness either. And certainly when you're first in a diagnosis process, whether it's endometriosis, which affects 1 in 10 women, whether it's rheumatoid arthritis, whether it's Crohn's disease, which affects your bowel and all of those things. None of us wake up. And my conditions is I have an autoimmune condition and I have a balance condition through vertigo. So I was 35, doing yoga 3 times a week, taking personal training, walking the 30 minutes to and from work in Australia. And I had dark circles under my eyes. And I went to the GP or general practitioner and said, I've got these dark circles, makeup won't cover them. Can you tell me what it is? And at 35, that led to a diagnosis of a life-threatening autoimmune condition that I cannot cure, cannot be cured, but can be managed. And I didn't expect to live to the age I am now. So I didn't expect to live to 50, and I'm 51 now. Drugs changed in that period, which made it more possible for me to continue. The condition is still life-threatening, but it continues to be managed. So what that did was, my background's actually in philosophy, and while I was working in the corporate world, I was also running philosophy in the pub as a side hustle, which I loved. And I did that for a long period of time, taking people on philosophy tours to Europe. So this was what I was doing. This was my passion while I was still in quite intensive treatment. And there came a time where the treatment needed to be so intense that the side effects of the medication were that I couldn't walk. I was bedbound for 6 months. And then I had to find my way back to work. And then I did that in 2012 to 13. And then I got a new diagnosis in 2016, completely unrelated. So I got a new diagnosis in 2016, completely unrelated. And then I was bedbound again for another 6 months. So what that did is I had to find a way to stay connected to myself and stay in my power, even though from world standards, I was disabled, I wasn't well, and I was using insurance to help me with income, but I did make it back to the office both times. And through that process, I worked out what helps during that period. I worked out how to get that sort of internal self-esteem strength. I worked out how to have boundaries with people who may not have been the most helpful. And I learned how to navigate the uncertainty that comes with chronic illness and the inevitably complex emotional terrain. So people just started to ask me then, friends who had breast cancer and that, for help and how I navigated it, because it was very clear that I did not relinquish my power in that time. And in fact, I would argue that I built it, even though I was much more physically vulnerable. And that led to me developing a whole program for women. I used exactly the same process that had helped me. So I run a 6-month program called Queen of the Underworld, because living with chronic illness is like a mythological trip to the underworld. It's not the overworld arc of success and normal career that most people are used to. It's actually a descent where you get stripped down and then you have to ascend back up. And so that's what I now do full-time with my life, or as I like to say, full-time for somebody living with chronic illness. And I run my work and I hold my clients in a way that works for me and my body.
I just have so many questions. So first of all, thank you for sharing all of that. And I'm so glad we're shining light on this, because again, as women, we face so many things, right? We have societal expectations and norms and limitations, and then pairing that with a chronic illness, a complex emotional and physical journey. And so I'm so glad that you're here doing this work. I'm really being drawn to having you talk a little bit more about that decision you made to not only embrace that inner strength, but grow it during that time. Because I think a lot of people, like you said, go through this fear, and that can really make us shrink and hide and just not want to do anything and want to give up. So tell us more about how you cultivated that.
So I'm not a therapist. I'm a mentor and a coach in that way. But I had this incredible internal curiosity all my life, which is how I ended up doing a degree in philosophy, about what is the good life and how to navigate the terrain of life itself. Because everybody who wakes up and faces the day is a courageous person. Like, that's what it takes to meet life every day. So I was interested in this internal conversation about the good life. And what that means is that when I was faced with life-threatening illness, I was interested in the good death. And that was really the conversation I was in with myself, because the good life, if we go all the way back to the Greeks, is not a normative success status-based approach to life. It is more about the cultivation of harmony and connection and good food and good rest and leisure and the wholeness of you as a human person, a human being.
I subscribe to that. Yes.
Yeah. And so when we are working or we're in the culture in which we live, there's a lot of push, push, push,
Yes.
and being seen to be professional and being seen to adapt to the world and not having any crisis. And yet, most of us will experience at work being with our team, our colleagues, whether we're a team worker or managing, everybody will go through difficult things. Most people are going through difficult things all the time.
Right.
And the pandemic has not changed that. In fact, what it has given is everybody an experience of a health crisis. So this is really interesting because everybody knows now what it's like to be stopped, be housebound, trying to work remotely when there's a lot of stress, wondering when it's going to end, when are we going to be safe again, when can I get back to life? Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of like most people with chronic illness, we looked at the pandemic and we're like, welcome to my life. Like, this is it. This is what I do.
Right.
What I do then in terms of navigating this is I had these deep questions within myself, and I refused to have my identity sort of cordoned off and be told that because I had chronic illness, life was over. That I could never have my dreams, I could never do what I wanted to do, that there was no love, and that my job was to get better. And when I got better, then life would begin again.
So you have to put your life on hold.
Yeah. And so what's interesting about this is because that's the natural trajectory of illness, right? Yeah. You get sick, you probably get worse, then you get better and life goes on. But chronic illness is different because the very nature of it is chronic, and you might get better and then you might be unwell, then you might get better, and it's all just a bit of a seesaw. So we need a different story of illness, and that's what I'm committed to. And personally, I found that in mythology. And the reason that I found it in mythology is because, let's face it, mythology are the stories of psychological development. That's what mythology is. Mm-hmm. And the hero's story in that process is, if we think of any of the great myths, also reflected in our culture, the movies and stories we read, is that the hero is thrust unwittingly into an adventure. He meets the guides, he conquers the dragon, and he comes back to community and shares his gifts. And that's pretty much what the success arc is in our world as well. That's what we talk about. You've got to keep going with the obstacles and the hurdles, and you've got to keep pushing through because eventually you'll be rewarded. Whereas with chronic illness, you physically cannot push through. And if you push through, the sicker you will get. So the story for chronic illness is much more like the mythology of the underworld. And we can use the myth of Persephone, who gets taken as a maiden. She goes down to the underworld with Hades, the god of the underworld. And then she becomes a queen. And we don't know much about that story, but she rises back up a queen to the overworld. And a deal is made with Zeus and Demeter, her mother, and she cycles back down. So 6 months of the year she is in the overworld, and that is spring. And 6 months of the year she goes down to the underworld, and she is the guide for all the souls coming into the underworld. And one of the things about the Greek underworld, it is not the same as hell, as we've sort of been taught in our culture, because everybody goes to the underworld. And then you are guided on your passage. Now, the thing about this myth is it's actually based on a Sumerian myth that is 2,000 years older. And in that myth, there's two sisters, one who's the queen of heaven and one who's the queen of the underworld. And why this is important is because the queen of heaven goes to visit her sister in the underworld. And as she does, she goes through 7 gates where she strips off her power. And that's literally the experience of living with chronic illness, is you lose your identity that you've had in the overworld because you're suddenly taken out. You are stripped of your emotional capacity, and your physical capacity are lessened, and therefore you live in much more vulnerability.
Mm.
The other thing that happens is you're stripped down to your heart, because you cannot hide the vulnerability of your experience at different times. And so you have to be in relationship with your heart. And so this map of the psychological development, because what happens is, yes, she's stripped down, but when she returns, she puts all of that power back on.
Mm.
And so to answer your question, Angela, is to say that for me, immersing in that, I found a map of, okay, you get stripped down, you have a conversation with death, which is chronic illness, death of the world above, and then you put that back on, that power, and then you engage with people. And you might do that in a day. I put that power back on to be with a clinician. I put that power back on to set a boundary with family and friends.
Mm-hmm.
But this was sort of the map I used to navigate for myself so that it wasn't a descent and I'm just left there forever.
Right. Wow. For all those listening, my mind is blown, and I'm wondering if your mind is blown too, because I think this is such beautiful and powerful imagery. And, as in any sort of crisis or impactful, or dare I say traumatic moment, right? We're sitting there in our confusion, our emotions, right? Shock, grief, right? We experience all these emotions. But then what? Where do we go from here? So I love that you have this empowering model to move you through all of the different stages here. Because I think you're right. We don't want to look at it, but I think that's what commonly happens. We look at this descent and then we just sit here at the bottom, and it doesn't have to be that way.
And it's what culture will tell us. It's like when you get better, life begins again. But it's the same of when you get divorced, just wait the 3 years, the 10 years, then life will be better. And I run a program. So 99% of my work is with women with chronic illness, but I run a program for women generally. And you can use this same mythology that I would just give you as a takeaway bite. You are meant to mature from the maiden into your maturity. And the culture would have us stay in our maiden. But the myth for that, the story for that is the same myth, because remember, even in the Greeks, Persephone goes down a maiden, but she comes back up a queen. And so divorce, redundancy, all of those things which mature you in your experience of life, just remember that going down as the maiden, because that is the innocence that then is transformed, you can then meet life through that strip down and rising into your, what I call your sovereignty. And I use that word specifically because your sovereignty means that you are sovereign of all of your resources, your physical, emotional, financial, creative, like all of your energy, you are sovereign on. And you get to decide how that gets shared.
Yes, beautifully said. And, I've had multiple coaches that all do different focused work, but I think we're all in this together, in that we are encouraging you who are listening right now. We are encouraging you, and we know that you have this power, you have this ability, and we want to awaken that in you, because you have so much choice in this, especially with illness, with what society says and dictates, that it just is so disempowering, and it's so heavy and terrible, and it doesn't feel like you have that autonomy and that choice. So this is so beautiful. I'm so glad you're sharing this, Michelle. This is so wonderful. I always ask my guests how you're living your bigger, braver life, but I think you really answered that. It's showing up every day and creating your own way and sharing with others how to empower yourself when at times it may not feel immediately or innately, the ability is not there to feel empowered.
And I think the important thing about that is when we don't live with chronic illness and we see somebody experiencing it, there's a oh gosh, that's hard, and we want to help. And some of the most common help is the most unhelpful for the person living with chronic illness. So we might say, oh, you could go listen to this woman, or you can just think positively, or have you tried this diet, or I heard of this. And what I want to share with you is that's actually the most unhelpful thing that you can do for somebody. The most helpful thing you can do is say, I'm with you and I'm here and I'm just present with you. Because actually that's your maturity to let life, however it is unfolding, and be present to it. And that transparency, then I want to say, Angela, is it looks like, sure, when you see me on a podcast or when you see me out at a summit or whatever, there's me and all of my energy. But that's the moment for that energy. What you don't see is having vertigo and being in bed for 2 days before it or 2 days afterwards. And so my relationship with myself is not to push. There are times when I know how to conserve my energy, but this is not my 24/7 experience. Like I have a treatment for my vertigo that was 32 needles yesterday. That's what I did yesterday. I went to the neurologist. I had 32 needles. I came home and rested. And now today I have some capacity and then I'll rest. And so that in itself is a model for everybody to just get a vision on. I have capacity, like my intellect, my creative capacity. I have energy to speak with you, but I do it in ways that work for me and my body.
Absolutely. That's a really good point, knowing that we have it and we get to do what works best for us. And I think that's that work. It's so important to do that work of truly knowing yourself at your core, what works for you, what doesn't work for you, what your values are, what you want to pour your energy into. And that's similar to the work that I'm doing with my clients as well. And I'm sure you're really sifting through that with yours. It's so generalizable to so many different areas in our life. It's so important because then you can figure everything out when you know those things.
Yeah. And I think that this is really, I've really chosen that my experience with other women is that I mentor them. And one of those reasons is this is my lived experience. So I run programs. There's lots of free content on my website. There's very small accessible programs. And then there's this 6-month program I run. But my job is always to support the sovereignty and power of the other woman for her to process herself through the experience. So a lot of people will say, this is just mindset and you need to get a positive mindset. And I will say, you need to know what is happening in your system and how to support that in a way that doesn't push yourself, but actually gives you a growth path forward. And that growth might be being in bed for 6 months. Like, we're not diminishing or taking away the physical experience. What we're giving you is a guidance and platform for you to navigate the emotional experience. And that is something that is not in the world, because if you don't live with chronic illness and you don't know those nights and those moments where you're like, I can't take it, I don't know how I'm going to navigate the chronic pain that I'm currently in, there's a wisdom that is held in the bodies and the experience of women who live this and have navigated this.
Sure.
And that, I think, is important to know for everybody. Is people can be super helpful. You would know about post-traumatic growth, Angela, like that would be part of your expertise. And then there's some parts of lived experience that give you skills and tools that are different to the therapy excavation of how did you get here.
100% right. And so part of my focus with folks from my lived experience, I use my expertise and my lived experience. It comes from a place of having this programming, work hard and perfectionist and the caretaker and all those things, and not caring for oneself. And that push, right? That push for success, or that push for that perfection or worthiness, value, all these societal things, right, that come up, or generational things that are programmed. It causes us to push. And then when we push, we break down or we get sick. So I talk about my lived experience, pushing myself to burnout, getting ill, and having to make that change.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the conversation that is actually going on And we think of mainstream media, which still has this arc, but mainstream as in all of us, this is the conversation we're having. And COVID has really highlighted that push burnout when there's nothing else to do as well, and the culture of what that is going back to work and navigating that. And that's a whole different discussion if you're living with chronic illness, because many women are at work and pushing or whatever, but there's a way in which we can do that is still supportive before that tips over into I have to leave, I have to resign.
Right. For the leaders, for the maybe business owners or folks that are leading teams, movements, what thoughts might you suggest for them to consider, whether living with a chronic illness or having folks on their team or, their colleagues or in their workplace that have the chronic illness to consider and manage?
So I think one of the most important things in this conversation is that we have a story of illness that your life, career, and love is over if you live with chronic illness. Mm-hmm. And we have this perception that when somebody says chronic illness, that they're bedbound. And I've certainly mentioned I've lived with chronic illness for 18 years. And yes, there are 2 times when I was bedbound, but the rest of the time I'm not. And I clearly am not in my everyday life. So I think one of the most useful things that we can do in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, which is such a big conversation now, and we've got neurodiversity in that space, is to recognize that there's this invisible missing piece of chronic illness in that space. And part of that is the stigma around the word chronic and illness. So for you to know that there are people out there who can support your staff, but also having people like myself, there's lots of people in this space who can come and talk to the organization, because my business partner in Washington and I, we are in the chronic illness and workspace. That's another piece of work in my business. And one of the biggest things that we find with our clients is women, men, they don't want to tell you what chronic illness is, but they want you to understand it. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to have somebody come and speak at your organization, like me or Jen Sharp or Nitika Chopra. There's women out there to come and speak about chronic illness specifically, and the sort of intersect between that and disability. Because there might be times we don't say to the disabled person, well, when you grow your arm, then you'll be good to work again.
Right.
But we do say to the chronic illness person, well, when you get over this, then it'll all be good and you can be promoted. So awareness is the first thing, and it's a conversation that COVID has opened up, especially long haul COVID, but it's a conversation that's needed now, and awareness is the first step. Then there's the step of, okay, we've got awareness, but what are the actions that we take? And that's the next step, how to support people in this process. And it needs specific resources and support that fit in with diversity, equity, and inclusion, but are not the same things. It's not the same type of support with somebody with chronic illness. And then, of course, there's the conversation about career advancement. So if we think about this as awareness and then support and advancement, then you've got a holistic model for so many of your staff that you don't know are navigating this behind the scenes.
Right. Wow, such a great topic of conversation. Just like you said, I think the times are highlighting that more now than ever. Please share with us how folks can get in touch with you, how folks can work with you and do more research, get into the advocacy portion as well.
So everybody can find me at Michelle Irving, irving.com.au. And you will find with me lots of free resources on the website. I have each year, last year and this year, I've run a chronic illness summit with some extraordinary women. It's a 10-day process and people can pop over. We just finished the last one 2 days ago, but you can go and access that, and you'll also find me on YouTube with some of those videos. In terms of working with me, when you go to the website, the program that I most specifically run is called Queen of the Underworld. You can have a look at that and you can book in a time completely complimentary and have a conversation with me. And if that program or other smaller programs I run are a fit for you, I will then share that with you. And that's, completely up for you if that is the next right step for you. Mm-hmm. It's also the case that if you need, for example, more significant mental health support, I'm very clear. I'm a mentor guiding you with the tools about what is the next right step for you and all of that about how to live well with chronic illness. Mm-hmm. And then anxiety and depression, which obviously go with chronic illness. I know quite a bit about navigating that on a daily basis. But if you need specific support, then I will refer you to somebody. There's a whole lot of therapists in the US who are actually trained around chronic illness and anxiety and depression. Mm-hmm. And I do take on private clients. I take on 2 at a time in terms of individually as my schedule allows. In terms of the corporate work, you can also reach out to me through the website and we will share with you then the corporate programs we run.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I love that you have such a host of options for folks to be able to contact you and utilize your knowledge and your advocacy and skills and things like that. So folks who are listening, we're going to include all of the information in the show notes for Michelle. I really encourage you to check out her, at least start with the free stuff, right? Start with the resources and the videos, but definitely check her out. Think about how advocacy could come into your business or your workplace too with this is so important. And if you are ready to create that clearer vision, make your dreams a reality and take action to live your bigger, braver life, you are always welcome on a call with me as well. So reach out to Michelle, reach out to me. Make sure you're joining us in the conversation for women living a bigger, braver life in the Facebook group. Thank you so much for being here, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me, Angela.
Thank you all for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.